Hello, I'm Caroline, welcome to my channel. In this video today, I'd like to read for you from this book, Cleopatra, the Queen of Kings. Be an eyewitness to the life of a powerful Egyptian ruler. I hope you enjoy it, so we'll just dive straight in. Cleopatra's Egypt. For over 3,000 years, Egypt was home to a rich and splendid civilization. But by 69 BC, when Cleopatra VII was born, Egypt's power was failing. The country was ruled by a dynasty of pharaohs, all called Ptolemy, who had arrived from Macedonia in 323 BC. Also, Egypt was also in danger of being taken over by its great rival Rome. The first Ptolemies had ruled well, but their descendants, including Cleopatra's father, were weak and even foolish. Cleopatra faced an uncertain future, but she was to become a daring and courageous queen, and one of the most famous women who has ever lived. Alexandria, Cleopatra's home, was a bustling port on the Mediterranean Sea. The early Ptolemies encouraged science, art and trade, and introduced many new ideas and inventions to Egypt. The Pharaoh's Tower was the world's first lighthouse. Built around 280 BC, it was destroyed by an earthquake in the 14th century. Today, it's remembered as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A family at war. From an early age, Cleopatra knew that her family was at war, with the people it ruled and with itself. The people suffered under the cruelty of Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, and they resented his alliance with Rome. In 58 BC, the citizens of Alexandria rioted and chased Ptolemy out of Egypt. Ptolemy fled to Rome, and Cleopatra's older sister Berenice became queen. In 55 BC, Ptolemy returned to Egypt. Helped by Roman general Pompey, he snatched back power from Berenice and ruled as pharaoh once more. Ptolemy then gave orders for Berenice to be executed. Pompey the Great. Pompey, 106 to 48 BC, was one of the most brilliant generals of his time. By helping Ptolemy XII, he hoped to increase Roman power in Egypt. All Ptolemy XII's children hoped to rule, and this made them rivals. Cleopatra's older sister Berenice IV ruled from 58 to 55 BC. Her sister Cleopatra Tryphena died mysteriously around this time. The rumour was that Berenice had murdered her. Cleopatra VII. At 14, Cleopatra had seen her father flee for his life and family members killed. She must have wondered how long she would survive. Ptolemy XII was pharaoh of Egypt during the years 80 to 58 BC and 55 to 54 BC. Ptolemy was disliked by his subjects because he collected heavy taxes and used the money and sent the money to Rome. Ptolemy hoped that if he made friends with the Roman leaders and paid the Romans enough money, they wouldn't invade his lands. Cleopatra's brothers. Cleopatra had two younger brothers, both called Ptolemy, according to family custom. They were both to become rulers of Egypt. As Ptolemy the 13th and Ptolemy the 16th. Cleopatra's sisters. Ptolemy had 4 daughters. Cleopatra's sisters were called Berenice the 4th, Cleopatra Tryphena the 6th, and Arsinoe the 4th. Cleopatra had only one sister still alive, the youngest Arsinoe. Symbols of power. Cleopatra's family, the Ptolemies, introduced many changes to Egypt. One of the most important was the use of coins for trade. Before the Ptolemies, coins were almost unknown. Egyptian merchants bartered goods instead. Coins also carried a political message. Images on the Ptolemies' coins showed them as rich and powerful. This beautiful portrait shows a Ptolemaic queen, Berenice II, sister and wife of Ptolemy III. A cornucopia, a horn overflowing with fruit and grain, is a symbol of wealth and prosperity. Portrait of Ptolemy XII. The Ptolemies paid to have their portraits carved in ancient Egyptian style, even though they were from Macedonia, northern Greece. They wanted to link themselves with the great pharaohs of Egypt's past. This carving at the Temple of Horus at Edfu shows Ptolemy XII conquering his enemies. While the Ptolemies faced problems in Egypt, the Roman Empire continued to expand. By 55 BC, the Roman army had conquered land in northern and southern Europe, in North Africa, and in the Middle East. The Roman army was a formidable fighting machine. Many thousands of well-trained soldiers marched into battle to win new lands for Rome. The coast around the Nile Delta was very flat, so the huge lighthouse helped ships find their way into Alexandria's harbour. Alexandria was a flourishing port on the Mediterranean. The rulers of Rome relied on Egypt to supply the people of the empire with grain and other foodstuffs. The teenage queen. Ancient records indicate that Cleopatra ruled with her father for a short time, and after his death in 51 BC, 18-year-old Cleopatra was determined to hold onto power. In keeping with the traditions of the time, she married her 12-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. Like all the Ptolemies before her, she didn't want to marry outside the royal family, because that might weaken its power. In law, Ptolemy now had the right to rule, but his sister said that he was too young. Cleopatra wanted to rule alone. However, Cleopatra knew that many nobles and royal officials supported her brother's right to rule, and General Pompey, her dead father's powerful ally, had plans to govern Egypt for Rome. The young Cleopatra knew she would need to use all her charm and intelligence to remain queen. Cleopatra clearly had a powerful and fascinating personality. even when young. Throughout history, she has always been portrayed as beautiful, as in this marble head. However, nobody knows for sure what she actually looked like. Life in Cleopatra's Egypt. Cleopatra and her family lived in Alexandria, Egypt's splendid capital city. The city had been founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC, and it had grown and prospered over 300 years of rule by the Ptolemies. Alexandria was one of the most important ports in the ancient world, and it was home to an exciting multicultural civilization, which blended Greek, Egyptian, and Middle Eastern ideas and beliefs. But to most ordinary Egyptians, Alexandria seemed strange and foreign, just like the Ptolemies themselves. In the first 2 years of Cleopatra's reign, the Nile failed to flood. There were crop failures and famines, and many ordinary people starved. As ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra needed to help the people and win their support, but she also needed to please the sophisticated citizens of Alexandria. This beautiful wall painting shows an ox harnessed to a sakieh, a wooden water wheel. As the ox walked around, the wheel turned, lifting water from the Nile to the fields. Oxen still pull water wheels in Egypt today. This wooden model of a boat was found in a tomb. Egyptians would have sailed up and down the Nile to take crops to market, to visit temples, and to trade. The Fayum is a large area of low-lying land in the desert of northern Egypt, surrounding a freshwater lake. The soil is fertile and the lake provides water for growing crops. Under the rule of the Ptolemies, many Greek settlers moved there, and it was a busy and prosperous area. Egyptian farmers also used a shaduf, a bucket fixed to a long wooden arm, to lift water from the river to irrigate their land. The Ptolemies introduced a machine for lifting water called an Archimedean screw from Greece to Egypt. Before the rule of the Ptolemies, wine was rare and expensive, and most Egyptians drank beer. The Greeks preferred wine, so they brought new winemaking skills to Egypt. Clever and charming. Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, just 4 days after Pompey was killed. When Caesar landed at Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII's supporters offered him Pompey's head as a gift. Caesar was horrified by this brutal murder. However, he wanted to keep the peace. He had come to Egypt to collect a huge sum of money that he claimed Cleopatra's father had owed him. So he ordered Cleopatra and Ptolemy to meet with him to discuss a peace treaty. Cleopatra did not trust her brother and knew that there was real danger that she would be killed if she came face to face with any of his advisors. She knew that she needed Caesar's protection. One night, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's room. She was about to use all her charm and intelligence to win his support. Some stories say that Cleopatra was hidden in a carpet and some inside a roll of bedding. A merchant called Apollodorus was persuaded by Cleopatra to risk his life to smuggle her into the heavily guarded palace. Caesar was astonished when the carpet was unrolled to reveal Cleopatra herself. Rulers like Cleopatra often sent rich gifts to powerful people, so Caesar wouldn't have been surprised when Cleopatra's servant brought him a beautiful carpet. Cleopatra quickly gained Caesar's support, but she still had enemies in Alexandria. Caesar, who had arrived with only a small army of men, was happy to find an ally in such a hostile city. A plot against Caesar. When Pothinus, Ptolemy's chief advisor, found out that Cleopatra had won Caesar's support, he plotted against him. Caesar's barber heard Pothinus's plans, and Pothinus was executed. Meanwhile, Arsinoe escaped from the city to join forces with General Achillas and the Egyptian army against Caesar. Julius Caesar, impressed by Cleopatra's courage and daring, Caesar was soon bewitched by her. A city of learning. Cleopatra used her knowledge and intelligence to stay in power. The Ptolemies helped to make Alexandria into a great centre of learning. In Cleopatra's time, the library was the greatest in the world. The Rosetta Stone. Text of the 3 languages used in Egypt in Cleopatra's time can be seen on the Rosetta Stone. Hieroglyphs used for royal decrees and religious texts. Demotic, a written simplified form of hieroglyphs, and Greek, Cleopatra's mother tongue. Cleopatra was famous for her knowledge of these languages and many others. The Rosetta Stone is a slab of basalt rock found near Rosetta in the Nile Delta. When Ptolemy XIII heard that Cleopatra was with Caesar, he ran out of the palace and threw down his crown in a terrible rage. The palace was now under siege by the Egyptian army. In the hope of appeasing them, Caesar allowed Ptolemy to leave the city and join his sister Arsinoe and General Achillas. Days after the war in Alexandria ended, Ptolemy's body was found in the harbour. For the first time in years, Cleopatra felt secure. Her enemy, Ptolemy XIII, and his advisers were dead, and Caesar promised to protect her and her new husband, her surviving brother, 11-year-old Ptolemy XVI. With Caesar, she sailed down the Nile to meet her subjects and impress them with her power. Rumours said that Cleopatra was pregnant with Caesar's child. When Caesar returned to Rome, he left 15,000 men to guard her. The temple walls were decorated with carved reliefs. Huge portraits of Cleopatra and her son Caesarion were later carved here. Julius Caesar was a brilliant army commander and ambitious ruler of Rome. After taking control in Egypt, Caesar returned to Rome in 46 BC, where he was welcomed as a hero. Cleopatra soon hurried to join him. She claimed that she was negotiating a peace treaty between Egypt and Rome, but she also wanted to make sure of Caesar's protection. Cleopatra brought her son Caesarion and teenage pharaoh Ptolemy XVI with her. She didn't want her brother or his advisors to try to seize power in Egypt while she was away. Many Romans were shocked by the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra. They were afraid that Caesar would name Caesarion as his heir, that Cleopatra's son would become rulers of Rome. Caesar celebrated his victories by parading his captives through the streets of Rome. Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe, who had led the Egyptian army against Caesar, was dragged through the streets, bareheaded and in chains. It was a disgrace for a woman to appear in public this way. It was the custom for Roman women to wear a long cloak and veil outside their homes. However, Arsinoe was lucky. Unlike other captives, she wasn't killed. Caesar feared that the Romans might riot if they saw a princess publicly executed. To give thanks for his victory at the Battle of Pharsalus, Julius Caesar built a new temple in Rome dedicated to Venus Genetrix, Venus the Great Mother. Caesar also paid for a beautiful statue of Cleopatra to be put on display in the temple. It showed her as a mother holding Caesarion in her arms. This picture shows the ruins of the Roman Forum, where Caesar built his temple to Venus Genetrix. The death of Caesar. As a reward for his victories, the Senate made Caesar dictator for the next 10 years in 46 BC. 2 years later, he was made dictator for life. But some Romans feared that Caesar was becoming too powerful and that he wanted to be king. About 60 conspirators decided he must be killed. Julius Caesar was stabbed to death after a Senate meeting in 44 BC. The plot to murder Caesar was led by Brutus and Cassius. After Caesar was murdered in 44 BC, the shocking news spread like wildfire around the Roman world. Cleopatra, who was in Rome when the murder happened, lost no time in hurrying back to Egypt. Now that Caesar, her protector, was dead, her kingdom was once more in danger. Many hostile countries saw Egypt as a rich prize and hoped to conquer it. Cleopatra kept her son Caesarion close by her side, because she feared that he might be murdered by Caesar's enemies. Ptolemy XVI disappeared mysteriously, and people said that Cleopatra had poisoned her brother so that she could rule Egypt with her young son. Life back in Egypt wasn't easy for Cleopatra. She tried to win support from Alexandrian nobles by offering them rich rewards. She appeared in a window of audience in the royal palace and threw gifts to the crowd, but many people still saw her as a traitor because of her friendship with Caesar and her long visit to Rome. For 2 years during Cleopatra's reign, the Nile floods failed. There wasn't enough water in the river to spread rich mud over the fields or to irrigate them. As a result, farmers' crops and animals died, and many ordinary families suffered from famine and disease. The Nile floodwaters were very important to the Egyptian survival, so they measured the levels carefully every year. They built measuring devices called nilometers along the banks of the river so they could check how fast the floodwaters were rising or draining away. The steps and the marks on the walls of the nilometers were used to measure the water levels. When the floods failed, the fields baked hard in the hot sun and no crops could grow. On her return to Egypt, Cleopatra found out that her sister Arsinoe was plotting with Caesar's enemies and hoped to seize control of Egypt with their help. Many nobles in Cleopatra's court supported Arsinoe and joined in her conspiracy against Cleopatra. Many nobles and officials were angry that Cleopatra didn't help the famine victims, but in fact, as Egypt produced most of the grain in the Roman world, there was nowhere else to buy supplies from. Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra's daring plan worked. Her dramatic visit to Tarsus had won Antony's support in her struggle to remain ruler of Egypt. Antony forgot his war against the Parthians and hurried to Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra spent the winter of 41 BC together in Alexandria, and Cleopatra hardly left Antony's side. She watched Antony exercise with his troops and took him on splendid boat trips down the Nile. She flattered him, listened to his battle stories, and entertained him at fabulous feasts. Cleopatra also became pregnant with twins. Antony was their father, but he didn't see them born. Early in 40 BC, Antony had to return to Rome because his wife, Fulvia, was leading a rebellion against Octavian. Cleopatra arranged lavish banquets to entertain Antony. Greek and Roman writers told how Cleopatra ordered 12 boars to be cooked, one after the other, so that one of them would be ready at a time when Antony chose to eat. They also claimed that Antony and Cleopatra dressed up as servants and then went out onto the streets of Alexandria after dark, playing tricks on people. Drinking and dancing. The city of Alexandria was a sophisticated and luxurious city, and evenings spent drinking wine and dancing had always been popular in the palaces of the Ptolemies. Musicians, acrobats and dancers entertained guests at Cleopatra's feasts. Like all Ptolemies, Cleopatra spared no expense to provide amusements and entertainments for her guests. Guests lounged on their couches, eating from plates of food carried in by an army of servants. Tables were set with gold and jewelled cups and plates. Their couches were covered in the finest fabrics, often woven with gold and silver threads. Stories abound about Cleopatra's extravagance. This 18th century painting was inspired by the story that tells how Cleopatra dissolved a priceless pearl in wine and drank it. In fact, pearls are not harmed by wine. Alexandria was famous for producing beautifully decorated glassware, such as this pretty drinking cup. This carving shows a Roman wedding ceremony. Late in 40 BC, Antony's wife, Fulvia, died. Antony made a peace treaty with Octavian, and as a sign of friendship, he married Octavian's sister, Octavia. The Battle of Actium. As Cleopatra's friend and Octavian's rival, Antony joined in the war against Rome. Antony also didn't want to lose control of his lands in the east of the Roman Empire, which included Greece. Fearing an attack by Rome, Antony and Cleopatra sailed to Greece with a huge fleet of warships. In spring 31 BC, the Roman forces arrived, and for several months Octavian's fleet patrolled the Greek coast, fighting Antony's soldiers, capturing his forts and sinking his ships. Worst of all, they trapped Antony and Cleopatra's fleet in the Gulf of Ambracia. The land around the Gulf was marshy and damp, and in the summer heat the soldiers and sailors became very ill with malaria. Food and water supplies ran out, and many of them deserted. By September the situation was desperate. Antony and Cleopatra decided that they must try to smash through the Roman blockade. Egyptian and Roman warships didn't usually carry sails into battle because they were heavy and took up valuable space. Instead, warships were powered by men rowing with oars. Before the Battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra ordered their warships to have sails ready to hoist. They hoped to smash through the Roman blockade and sail away as soon as they reached the open sea. Admiral Agrippa. Octavian's advisors included Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, 64 BC to 12 BC, one of Rome's most famous army commanders. Octavian knew that he couldn't trust Agrippa and that he understood naval strategy and tactics far better than Antony or Cleopatra. A losing battle. The Romans and Egyptians fought battles at sea in two different ways. First, they tried ramming enemy warships with their ships' strong bronze beaks, shaped spikes attached to the front of the ships. If this failed, they used ropes and hooks to snatch enemy ships and haul them alongside, so that the soldiers could jump from deck to deck and fight a battle with swords, as if they were on land. Once out in the open sea, Cleopatra realized she could escape. She took her chance and sailed away. Her enemies said that this was cowardly, but in fact it was a wise decision and may have been planned with Antony. She hoped to save her ships and her treasure so that she could fight another day. Antony managed to sail after Cleopatra, but the rest of his warships couldn't get past the Romans. His ships were destroyed, many of his soldiers were killed, and most of them surrendered to Octavian. Defeat and dishonour. Defeat at the Battle of Actium plunged Antony into despair. He hid away on Pharos, an island in Alexandria harbour, and refused to see anyone. But Cleopatra bravely made plans to continue as Egypt's ruler. Her spies told her that Octavian didn't have enough gold to pay his armies, so he couldn't attack immediately. But Cleopatra knew Octavian would attack sooner or later, because he needed Egypt's wealth. In time, Antony came out of hiding, and once again, splendid banquets were held in the palace. Almost a year after Actium, the news came. The Romans were on their way. Cleopatra sent a message to Octavian, offering to give up her throne if he would let her children rule. But Octavian didn't reply. It was clear that Octavian wanted to rule Egypt himself for Rome. Antony rallied his army and rode out of the city to face Octavian. Cleopatra knew that her future was uncertain if Octavian invaded Egypt. She began to experiment with poisons and gave orders that work on her mausoleum was completed as soon as possible. Skilled stoneworkers would have worked on Cleopatra's tomb. They decorated the outside with beautiful designs carried into the surface of the stone. As soon as her mausoleum was completed, Cleopatra gave orders for her treasures to be stored there. She believed that her spirit would survive after death to enjoy them. More importantly, she wanted to keep her gold and jewels safe. Cleopatra announced that she would set fire to the mausoleum and destroy the treasure if the Roman army marched on Alexandria. A gold falcon, symbol of the Egyptian god Horus. Dionysus. Antony believed that he was protected by the god Dionysus. Sometimes he felt he had become the god. The Greek historian Plutarch tells a chilling story. The night before Octavian marched on Alexandria, the citizens heard the sound of laughter and footsteps leaving the city. They said this showed that Dionysus had deserted Antony. The death of Antony. Antony was forced to flee from Octavian's army when most of his soldiers refused to fight. Antony was disgraced and ashamed, and he blamed Cleopatra. Afraid of his anger, Cleopatra locked herself in her mausoleum and sent a message saying she was dead. In despair, Antony stabbed himself. When she heard the news, Cleopatra sent her servants to carry Antony to her, and he died in her arms. The death of Cleopatra. Within weeks of Antony's suicide in 30 BC, Cleopatra was dead, and Egypt was governed by Rome. Cleopatra was the last independent ruler of Egypt, and her death marked the end of over 3,000 glorious years of Egyptian civilization and Egyptian power. Although she did her best to defend her country, clever, charming Cleopatra could not defy the might of Rome. After Antony died, Roman troops surrounded Cleopatra's mausoleum and kept her prisoner there, but Octavian treated her well. He allowed Cleopatra to arrange Antony's funeral and to take part in the ceremony, but he would not agree to let Cleopatra's children rule Egypt on behalf of Rome. So Cleopatra decided she must die. She couldn't bear to live while foreigners ruled her land. At her death, Egypt lost its most famous and possibly its greatest queen. A final feast. It is said that before her death, Cleopatra ordered a splendid feast. She then asked one of her servants to smuggle in a poisonous snake in a basket of figs. After Cleopatra had eaten, she sent a note to Octavian asking to be buried with Antony. Alarmed, Octavian sent guards to find her, but it was too late. Cleopatra was already dead. A mysterious end. Cleopatra's body has never been discovered, so historians don't know exactly how she died. There are stories that she experimented with poisons and that she even tested some of them on slaves. The most popular story about Cleopatra's death says that she was bitten by a small poisonous snake called an asp. But an asp would not have been able to bite Cleopatra and her two servants. Cleopatra's faithful servants, Iris and Charmian, were found dead and dying beside her. They probably believed that they would go on serving her in the afterlife. Charmian was the last to die. Cleopatra let the snake bite her, and in seconds she was dead. Cleopatra chose to be dressed like her favourite goddess, Isis, who was honoured as the special protector of Egyptian pharaohs and queens. Funeral ceremony. Cleopatra's mausoleum has not been found, so historians don't know whether her funeral followed Greek or Egyptian traditions. However, Cleopatra worshipped many Egyptian gods, so it is probable that her funeral followed Egyptian traditions. It's likely to have been a simple ceremony, because Octavian would have wanted the people of Egypt to forget their queen and accept him as their ruler. And that's where I'm going to end this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please join me for another one soon.